This is going to be one of the harder things to open up to you about with respect to telling you the various stories about my life, and specifically in this theme of moving to a better place and being somewhere you want to be. And it's ironic because, on the one hand, the 3 different times I moved to Florida, I believed that I was chasing my dream for the first time in life. And yet, in each case, each move to Florida that I made turned out to constitute one of the darkest periods of my 33-year long, thus far, life. So, okay, let's establish some context. I've explained to you that I grew up in central New Jersey, that I started college in north central Jersey at Kean University, which is sort of between Union and Elizabeth, New Jersey. Very urban area that I wasn't in love with. I had a frame of mind that was rather in love, in fact, with the beach, especially the Caribbean and the tropical beaches and that kind of thing. And so in the midst of my freshman year of college at Kean University, back in 2004, I started seeing a guidance counselor at the college and talking to her about my frustrations and depression and anxiety. And it was her suggestion that I search for a college in an environment where I would be happier. Now there's a lot of loaded complexity that starts to transpire here. So, and this is why I talk so much about the relationship between, at least in my case, philosophy and autobiography, because in my case, the significant motions in my life that have tended to move it in better or worse directions have tended always to be deeply entwined to philosophical ideas. So there we have it. Okay, let's start with some coffee, though. I love my coffee. This wonderful coffee cup. I know that's kind of gross, the coffee stain from the drip. I apologize about the unpleasant aesthetic appearance that you had to see there. When I was at Kean University, though I did enjoy wonderful friendships and talked to a lot of people, I also spent a lot of time reading. Specifically, I did a lot of reading the beat poets, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Charles Bukowski, William S. Burroughs, people in that gang of thought, school of thought, if you will. Now, without digressing too much into the depths of all of the philosophical and aesthetic ideas that go along with particularly the beat poets, and I was a hippie in these days, and I referred to myself as a hippie, though my nickname at college was actually fake hippie because I didn't smoke pot. I was what they called straight edge in those days. I refused to drink alcohol, refused to smoke pot. I was what you might call a goody two-shoe, maybe. I don't know. I was terrified of the thought of trying to alter my state of consciousness, if you will, in those days. So, that being said, though, I was fascinated with hippie culture and beatnik culture of the 50s and 60s. And most fascinating to me, probably at that time, was Jack Kerouac's On the Road And this idea that he traveled the country and, he hitchhiked place to place and on the road tells that story in a fictionalized way. And a young aspiring poet as I was at the time, I developed this deep desire to myself travel the country and just write poetry. And that's all I wanted to do, was travel and write. So I had it in my mind that perhaps I should drop out of college. And I was developing a plan to do that and talking to my father about it. And my father, sort of along the lines of the guidance counselor I was seeing, it was his opinion that as opposed to, what is it Eminem says? Fuck school, I'm too cool to go back. Show me the mic. Show me where the fucking studio's at. As opposed to that way of thinking. It was really the idea of my dad that if you have such a desire for adventure, why not just find a college that speaks to your sense of adventure? Find a place, find a college elsewhere that you might find inspiring and interesting. And so I did. And as I told you in my previous video, I was looking at Florida Gulf Coast University. I was looking at the University of Southern Florida, and I was looking at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. And the decision ultimately was to go to Florida Gulf Coast University because I found it to be the most beautiful. I was blessed with the opportunity to visit the campus and get a sense of it. I don't even possess the vocabulary to describe for you how amazing the Florida Gulf Coast University campus is and how it spoke to my intense desire to live someplace where the geography was just so visually stimulating. I love coffee. To describe it in the simplest terms as I can, essentially you've got a lot of swamp land, and then you've got some university buildings, and you've got some beautiful new apartment buildings with a man-made lake. And there were these bridges that you could walk, these boardwalks that were, they laid above bodies of water. And you had alligators and all kinds of wildlife that you'd want to be some kind of ecologist or biologist to appreciate just the complexity of life forms, various animals and plants and trees and grasses, etc. I was initially so happy to be away from New Jersey. It was this miracle. It really was to me initially this miracle. You spend your entire life somewhere, right? I was 18, 19, and all I knew was New Jersey. I knew Cream Ridge, New Jersey, with my father, very rural. I knew suburban Robbinsville, started rural and became suburban throughout my adolescence, and now it's grown more suburban than rural. Those are the two places I knew, and then I had that taste of Union and Elizabeth, New Jersey at Kean University. But the Fort Myers, Naples, Estero area on the Gulf Coast of Florida, Southwest Florida. This was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. A lot of swampland, a lot of dead-looking fields, Melaleuca trees, these skinny white trees. A lot of open space, more open space than I could wrap my mind around. Beautiful sunsets every day. And so there's this sense of living a poet's dream or an artist's dream that was the essence of the experience initially. But here's where the story gets really quite dark now. And it's interesting because we want to try and not digress too much and stay on focus with respect to the subject of place, trying to live someplace better in your life, the philosophical ideas surrounding that, and not getting into other things that may happen in that place beyond the placeness, not to get too abstract here. But what is so interesting about my experience, particularly at Florida Gulf Coast University, in this place, for whatever reason, in terms of how a place can inspire and bring things out of you, initially I felt very, for lack of better terms, free at Florida Gulf Coast University, whereas I didn't at Kean University. You may recall I told you, not much open space. The dorms felt like I was in a prison, etc. Whereas in contrast, at Florida Gulf Coast University, there's this sense of like endless wilderness. Live in your own bedroom in a new, beautiful apartment building. There's just this sense of being more liberated. And so with that, I really start delving into my philosophical assumptions in various realms. And the most basic ones would include this. First of all, falling into a very deep deterministic or fatalistic way of thinking, and also falling into a nihilistic way of thinking. People who know me but don't know me so much may wonder why I have such a vicious and visceral hatred for nihilism. As I tell you more about this, it will become clear. And it's just so interesting that the experience of determinism and nihilism are inseparable from my being embedded in Florida, and specifically at FGCU. And as I'll tell you later, when I end up living in South Beach in Miami, and later in Tampa. But sticking to Florida Gulf Coast University here. Where a lot of things happen in a negative way. So let's start with the whole determinism thing. As I'm there taking these classes, living in this new and beautiful place, although it speaks to this desire I had to be very much closer to the beach, be somewhere with a tropical feel, be somewhere where the environment's very beautiful and invigorating and stimulating, all of that, though it speaks to that unvetted, really when you think about it, and scrutinized desire, beyond that, there's this question of, what am I really doing here? not just why am I in Florida. There was a superficial rationale for why I moved to Florida, why I moved to the Fort Myers area, Florida Gulf Coast University, but why move there to go to college? What was I hoping to achieve with a college education in the first place? Why? And that was a question I could not answer. As I understood it at that time, in terms of the few really deep philosophical convictions I held, the most fundamental one was this: I was there because I just happened to be there. It was all a matter of fate. It was just inevitable. I listened to a lot of Bob Dylan in those days. I mean, I still do, but I think I listened to Bob Dylan too much in those days, as if there was no time to do anything but listen to Bob Dylan or Jim Morrison or contemplate their lyrics. There's this song, you might know it, Sooner or Later, when he says, "Sooner or later, one of us must know. You just did what you're supposed to do." And that line really resonated with me. I would play that song over and over again and thought, here I am, just because I'm supposed to be here. And what makes this even more complicated is, okay, so I've got this philosophical assumption as a determinist that I'm just here as a product of fate, right? But I also make my own assumptions, irrational, unvetted assumptions, as to what I think my fate is going to end up being. And because at that time I wanted to be a rich and famous poet, there's thinking about what that means with respect to my future. And it happens to be the case that I had this irrational assumption that it was my fate to inevitably become a rich and famous poet. And that was that. So, in other words, right, to explain this to you in very concrete terms, and to me, it's very important you understand this, because should it ever happen to you, I mean, I hope you don't make the kind of philosophical mistake I made here. Okay, so, right, to put this in, to make this as clear as I can, I hold the assumption that the way the universe works is this: we just do whatever it is that the universe intends for us to do. We have no control whatsoever over what happens in our lives. We just move like the trees move in the wind. It's just beyond the realm of our brains. We are just pure physics, and that's that. And I further assume that it just so happens, I thought, that physics would lead me to eventually be this rich and famous poet. So in other words, my time spent at Florida Gulf Coast University was me twiddling my thumbs, waiting for the universe to make this transition whereby something was going to happen beyond my capacity to understand or have anything to do with it, that would just lead me to become this rich and famous poet. Somebody was going to hear a poem I read or bump into me and start asking me questions about my poetry and fall in love with it and tell everybody else. I don't know. In some way, shape, or form, something was going to lead me to become very famous. And again, it was beyond me. But this meant in the meantime, what was I making of my life and my circumstances? It's very important to understand that this is the predominant thought I'm having. You couldn't possibly begin to understand my psychology and my psychological development and how my life grows more complicated and awful without understanding these are the basic assumptions I hold at this time. Next is this: my introduction to marijuana. pot, ganja, weed, whatever you want to call it, grass, whatever. Now, it's a very strange thing that occurs in my life, and also an extremely unfortunate and consequential thing, and a very philosophical thing, as you will see. Now, I associated with a group of people who liked to smoke pot. I did not, however, and it would become a topic of discussion. Oh man, pot is so awesome. Why do you not smoke pot? You're so close-minded. You don't know what you're talking about. How can you diss pot? How can you beef with pot, yo, when you don't know what you're talking about, right? And I don't know that it was actually said that way. I was just playing with slang that I've picked up over the years. I now learned that you not only can have beef with someone, but beef can also be a verb, and you can beef wit someone. I found that very interesting. Anyway, so it does occur to me that it is a fact that I do have these, at this time, I am utterly biased and subjective in my views on marijuana. That is to say, I have this assumption that it's just bad and that I want nothing to do with it, and therefore I won't smoke it. Therefore it's bad, because I just have this preconceived idea that it is. And it occurs to me that's an unsubstantiated idea. I don't know for a fact that marijuana is bad. I cannot prove that marijuana is bad. So now you see here's an interesting going on, where on the one hand, I have a very determinist view, metaphysical view, and I also have a very subjective view of how my deterministic life is somehow going to transpire. Yet, I actually have this conflicting, ironic, sort of logical and empirical part of myself. And that part of myself is saying, in a not fully rational process, I don't know that pot is bad. I can't prove that pot is bad. I therefore shouldn't say that pot is bad until I've tried it and can verify. Never mind the fact that I could have, I think I've talked about this in another video, but never mind the fact that there are more ways to learn about whether or not something is good or bad for you than throwing yourself into it. But that's another conversation. I actually had good intentions, for ironically, even if not a good, thorough thought process. So I tried pot. And it was I perceived it as, or I interpreted it as, such a positive experience that I fell in love with it. So, without detaching and digressing too much from this broader theme, or really more specific theme, this theme of my intention, which is place, moving someplace better, and how I get from Kean University to Florida Gulf Coast University, all I can say is it's interesting how your philosophy moves with you, and how you can associate place with certain philosophical themes. Beyond just, the aesthetics of where you live, right? If you examine where I was when I was at Kean University, the most basic philosophical thing going on then is grappling with the aesthetics of my surrounding. I mean, there are other thoughts like, what I'm supposed to do career-wise and whether or not my education is worth it, but I don't really get, as a thinker, more complex than that. Whereas, suddenly I'm at Florida Gulf Coast University, and I'm delving into the depths of my determinism, and again, an inability essentially to think critically and So when I smoke pot there at Florida Gulf Coast University and fall in love with it, and I lack the ability to really process what it meant in a more holistic and thorough and rational way. The problem is, now I don't know what the full chemistry or biology is with what one might refer to as an addiction to marijuana. But I will tell you that certainly, if only in an OCD context, I was in a certain way, from that point on, addicted to marijuana. And I don't want to venture too deep into the topic at this point or go on too much further because the video is getting a little bit longer than I wanted to. So let's just say this, and I'll build on and tell you more in the next video. It's one of those things that you'll never forget, though. I take my first couple of puffs, if you will, out of the pipe, and colors come alive. We're driving in the car up and down some road. I forget which road. It's very close to the university, and all the flowers and the sidewalks and grass, everything becomes super illuminated, and it's as if all of the beauty that I always knew existed in the universe and always had an attachment to intensified. And in addition to that, all of this love that I believed that I had and felt for everyone and everything, in this sort of hippie mentality that I had, intensified. And I found myself just feeling utter, what seemed to me at the time to be this utter peace and love trance. And it felt as if this made my writing very good, because I had these writing sprees, and it occurred to me that to become one with the universe, I was going to have to smoke pot, and to be a good poet, I was going to have to smoke pot. This gets even more complicated now. This just scratches the surface of the psychology and philosophy that starts to transpire. What happens next, and this is where I'm going to leave you with the cliffhanger, we're just going to say this, the next time I smoke pot, the second time, it induces extreme paranoia. It induces an extreme string of panic attacks. I become certain that I'm dying, and it becomes one of the most traumatic experiences I've ever had in my life, actually. And you'd think maybe I'd have the common sense at that point to say, this isn't the thing for me. But alas, confused with the fact that the prior time I had smoked pot was so wonderful, and the fact that after the paranoia went away and the anxiety attacks subsided, everything was very tranquil. Why not do it again and figure out what went wrong? And again and again and again. And while some people do not find their lives utterly ruined by smoking pot, I would suffer a serious psychological, mental, I don't know if breakdown is the right word, something like that. It would lead to me dropping out and other things. And we'll talk more about that in the next video. Thank you so much for your time, and I will chat with you again soon. Bye.